Immanuel Kant, born in 1724, sought to resolve a controversy that had been brewing for over a century. How do we come to know things? Some philosophers, called rationalists, looked at how we know mathematical truths. They argued that knowledge is based on reasoning inside our minds. Other philosophers, called empiricists, disagreed. Reason is a powerful processing tool, but what does it process? Impressions from the senses. All knowledge must come from the senses.
Kant looked at this situation and thought there's got to be something terribly wrong here, and attempted to reconstruct rationalism in such a way that it respected the demands that the empiricists had imposed. Kant was essentially struggling to find a compromise between rationalism as it had existed with Leibniz and Descartes and empiricism as it had come bouncing out of England, all full of excitement and gumption. He put together a synthesis that was really, really very good. It was really very imaginative. And it dominated philosophical thought for at least a century and a half. And some of my colleagues are still inclined to think that Kant had it essentially right.
Kant agreed in part with the empiricists that all our knowledge begins with the senses. But he also agreed in part with the rationalists that the relationships and structures of our knowledge come from reason.
What Kant talked about were the various faculties of the human mind and how these, in effect, shaped what we saw. We have five senses, and the way we perceive the world is, to a certain extent, structured by those senses, by the sensory apparatus. In the same way, Kant suggests we have concepts, and he would argue that these concepts are a priori. In some sense, they're necessary. And we can't change those, but how we conceive of the world is shaped by those concepts.
When he was a young philosopher, Kant had favored rationalism. He was impressed by the theories of Sir Isaac Newton and other great figures of the scientific revolution. He felt that they demonstrated the power of reason to uncover the inner laws and underlying structures of the universe. The senses perceive only the surfaces of things. Reason is able to grasp their real inner nature.
I freely admit it. It was David Hume's remark that first, many years ago, interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave a completely different direction to my inquiries in the field of speculative philosophy.
Hume's skepticism disturbed Kant. Hume argued that everything we know about the world depends on what we have perceived in the past. But we have no way of proving that what we perceived in the past will continue to hold in the future.
That there are no demonstrative arguments in the case seems evident, since it implies no contradiction that the course of nature may change. May I not clearly and distinctly conceive that a body falling from the clouds, and which in all other respects resembles snow, has yet the feeling of fire?
You see an apple fall to the ground after it ripens, but how do you know that what you perceive today will happen tomorrow? All you perceive is one group of sensations followed by another. In fact, what you have seen happen many times before may reverse itself tomorrow. We think we see billiard balls causing other billiard balls to move. But we actually see only round-colored shapes moving one after another. According to Hume, we can never be certain by any abstract power of reason that the next ball will move in the direction we might predict. Kant's answer was ingenious. He agreed that we know the world only through the ever-changing sensations we receive. But, he argued, the mind puts these sensations together into the orderly world we know. The mind has to see the world as orderly and stable.
If our sensations were completely unrelated to each other, knowledge could never arise. We have a unified mind. So our sensations must be organized into a unified experience. Otherwise, sensations would crowd into us and we could not know them. Unless our sensations are organized, they can mean nothing to us.
Our minds cannot know a chaotic world. The mind has to put order into the world. The world we know will always be orderly and stable, because we could not know it if it were not orderly. So the scientific laws that govern the world in the past will continue to govern it in the future. Knowledge begins with the senses, but the world of the senses must have a rational structure.
Kant's epistemology is often described in a simplified but not too misleading way as a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. He took from rationalism the idea that knowledge coming from reason rather than experience is crucially important in science. But he disagreed with the rationalists in thinking that reason alone, independently of experience, would be sufficient by itself to ground any kind of knowledge. And from there, he agreed with the empiricists that sense experience and observation is an indispensable source of all scientific knowledge. And the reason he's called a synthesis of the two is that his idea is basically reason and the senses have to cooperate. You can't have knowledge without both of them working together.
Kant thought that human knowledge is both passive and active. Knowledge from the senses is passive. Things make impressions on our senses. But we have to actively use our own concepts to understand and organize our sense impressions. Many of our concepts come from experience. But if we had no concepts to begin with, we could not organize our world, and so we could not know it at all. Those concepts that must be with us from the start, Kant calls a priori. They are prior to experience. A priori concepts serve as structures within which we organize experience.
What Kant means by a priori are the elements that make up the background framework, for example, the mathematical parts of the framework of a scientific theory. So, for example, in Newtonian physics, Euclidean geometry would be a priori for Kant, because that's not derived from experience, it's the presupposition of the experience. The law of gravitation, on the other hand, would be what he calls a posteriori, because once that framework is in place, we make observations of apples, planets, and so on, and we end up finally at the end of this process with the law of universal gravitation. So for Kant, what a priori means is what's presupposed by science before it sets to work on experience and observation to develop its scientific descriptions.
Like the empty structure of a house in which we arrange furniture, space and time, according to Kant, are empty forms in which we arrange all our sensations. Space and time and other concepts like causality and unity are a priori. They are structures in our minds that we use to organize our sensations. The world has an abiding structure that the mind can know, but only because that structure is in the mind from the beginning.
Hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. But all our attempts to extend our knowledge of objects have on this attempt ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success if we suppose that the objects must conform to our knowledge.
Kant was careful to make clear he didn't mean that we make up the world or that it exists only in our minds. To the contrary, he insisted that the world does exist in itself. But our minds cannot know this world in itself. we can know only the world of appearances that come to us through our senses.
Kant makes this distinction in his first critique between the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, this is roughly the nature, the world of objects in space and time, and a noumenal world which somehow stands behind this and supports it, but which is unknown. Human reason, or as he calls it, the human understanding, can cognize, theoretically cognize, or know nature, the objects in nature. But while we can form the thought of something beyond nature, we can't cognize it. And the reason is there's no matching intuition. There's no experience which matches our thought.
Some of the concepts that Kant thought were a priori are no longer accepted by science. For instance, Euclid's concept of three-dimensional space was shaken by new geometries that envisioned space as curved. These ideas spurred Einstein's theory of relativity. But the question remains, doesn't science always depend on some kind of abstract, underlying, perhaps a priori framework?
In talking about the a priori part, or the rational part of science, as a background framework, as something that has to be in place before the empirical observations can be processed, if you like, it's very helpful to think of it, the rational component, as a language. Just as you and I have to share a language in common before we can argue with each other and communicate. We have to both be speaking English. That has to be in place first before we can know anything or decide anything or discuss anything.
Euclid's concept of space provided a framework for Newton's theories of motion and gravity. Kant never dreamed any of these ideas would be replaced. But science is always subject to change, and perhaps the a priori framework changes also.
This led to, as it were, a linguistic version of the relativized a priori and a linguistic version of a kind of Kantian view. Rather than expressing the fixed structure of the human mind built into our cognitive wiring, as it were, since it's not built in, it changes with time, it changes in history, we should view it more as a language that evolves and changes and can even be completely overthrown and replaced by a different language as we evolve from one stage of science to another.
Kant's epistemology is a product of the 18th century Enlightenment. Philosophers of the Enlightenment rejected the idea that we should depend on religious or secular authorities. Instead, they held that each of us could find the truth on his or her own by using reason.
Enlightenment is man's release from his self-imposed tutelage. Have the courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of the Enlightenment.
Kant said that with the Enlightenment, man reached maturity, human beings reached maturity because they didn't have to, they saw that they didn't have to or weren't obedient to a higher authority like God or like the monarch, but that they were their own highest authority.
Kant's view is sometimes called the Copernican revolution in knowledge. Before Copernicus, everyone thought the sun revolved around the earth. Copernicus showed that the earth revolves around the sun. Before Kant, people thought the world shapes the ideas in our minds. Kant argued for the revolutionary view that the mind shapes the world.
Kant really puts in place something which has been present a long time, but which was never so clearly enunciated before, and which has stuck with Western thought, not just philosophical thought, ever since. The distinction between scheme and reality, the distinction between the conceptual organization, which we, either socially or for Kant individually, bring bring to raw sensation in order to organize it into something which we can think of as experience.
Immanuel Kant was the first to suggest that the way we see the world is in many ways constructed by our own minds. Many later philosophers have pursued his ideas and taken them in different directions. But Kant's central idea continues to prove remarkably durable. We can't just know the world as it is. Our perceptions of it are always shaped by our conceptual schemes.